silence. Millions watched live as the confrontation spiraled beyond politics, ripping open a wound America had tried to bury. This was the moment when two women clashed, and one question forced the whole country to face an ugly truth it could no longer ignore. But could Jasmine Crockett's courage spark the real change America has been running from for decades? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The United States Capitol stood cold under a slate-gray sky, its marble face hardened like a fortress before a siege. Inside, the Budget Committee room felt less like a hall of governance and more like a battleground. A long oak table, draped with American flags, split the room cleanly between Democrats and Republicans, each side bracing for a fight. Cameras lined the walls, their lenses gleaming like waiting eyes, while reporters hovered with pens ready to capture blood. Today's hearing would decide whether billions in social welfare funding would be slashed, a move dressed in fiscal responsibility but soaked in human cost. No one smiled. No one dared relax. Across that polished no-man's land sat Jasmine Crockett and Nancy Mace, two storms destined to collide. Jasmine sat upright, her navy suit crisp, her presence sharp as a blade. Her hands rested calmly on the table, but her eyes, dark, unwavering, missed nothing. She wasn't just attending, she was bracing for a war over dignity. Across from her, Nancy Mace leaned forward, a sheaf of notes clenched in one hand. Confidence in every line of her posture. Numbers and cold arguments filled Mace's papers. Lived experience filled Crockett's veins. The tension between them crackled, unspoken but undeniable. The chairman's gavel slammed once, loud, final, and the room fell into a brittle silence. Jasmine inhaled, slow and steady, as the battle for the soul of America began. The gavel's echo had barely finished vibrating through the heavy oak table when a sudden scrape shattered the silence. Nancy Mace pushed her chair back with a sharp, almost defiant movement, the legs dragging across the polished floor like a warning shot. She rose to her full height, her body stiff and deliberate, as if every inch of her had been rehearsed for this moment. Without smoothing her jacket or hesitating, she stepped forward, folder clutched loosely in one hand, the other free to slice through the air when needed. The cameras along the back wall whirred to life, their lenses adjusting, zooming, almost sensing that the first blow was about to be struck. Nancy didn't need to clear her throat. She didn't need to gather her thoughts. The speech was already loaded in her veins. Her eyes locked onto the room, scanning each face as if daring them to speak. Not seeking allies, not looking for validation. Daring someone, anyone, to challenge her before she even spoke. Her voice, when it came, was clear and sharp. Loud enough to fill the room, but measured enough to sound reasonable. "We have entire generations living off the system," she said, each word crisp, framed with just enough contempt to be unmistakable. She wasn't just making a point. She was drawing a battle line down the center of the room. She began to move, one slow step to the left, a subtle pacing that made her look larger, more commanding. She gestured toward the flag at the center of the table, as if wrapping herself in its meaning. "This cannot continue," she added, the phrase heavier the second time, dropping into the room like a stone into still water. The Democrats stiffened. The Republicans leaned slightly forward, readying themselves to back her if she pushed harder. She saw it. She fed off it, her hand cut downward sharply, punctuating her next point, that welfare had become less about lifting people up and more about giving them reasons to stay stagnant. "Hard-working taxpayers are footing the bill," she said, her voice tightening, sharpening, "for those who refuse to contribute." The words hung there, heavy and accusing, not spoken with anger, but with a cold certainty that made them more dangerous. It was not just a statement, it was an indictment. Nancy allowed the silence to settle, standing with the weight of her accusation fully exposed in the air. She didn't fidget. She didn't glance around for approval. She simply stood there, the embodiment of confident righteousness. And in that silence, everyone in the room could feel it, the sting, the division. The deep, old wound being ripped open again. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't even adjust her posture. But the stillness around her shifted, tightened, like the moment before a storm breaks. Nancy Mace had fired the first shot. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The last word fell from Nancy's lips like a blade striking stone. And for a moment, the room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would bleed first. On the right side of the table, a few Republican members leaned back slightly, nodding with tight, approving motions. Their expressions were carved into masks of solemn agreement, but in their eyes flickered the quiet satisfaction of a blow landed without resistance. Across the divide, the Democrats sat frozen, not because they were cowed, but because they knew every reaction would be twisted against them. Their faces hardened, their jaws clenched. The stillness grew heavier by the second. The cold fluorescent lights revealed every tense muscle, every tightly gripped pen, every hand curled into a silent fist beneath the table. Jasmine Crockett remained perfectly still among them, but the energy radiating from her chair was undeniable, a controlled fury, a gathering storm barely held in check. It wasn't just about the words Nancy had used. It was about what they meant. The old wound they ripped open again, right there in the heart of American power. The injustice was not new. It was ancient, coded into the very foundation of the room they were standing in. And once more, it had been given polite, televised permission to live. No one on her side spoke yet, but the silence had turned lethal. The silence after Nancy's speech was sharp enough to cut skin, but it did not last. Jasmine Crockett moved, not with haste, not with anger, but with a slow, deliberate grace that carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Her chair slid back with a low scrape, a single defiant note against the suffocating quiet. She rose without theatrics, her movements precise, her body taut like a drawn bow, ready to release. The room, already brittle with tension, seemed to pull tighter with every inch she gained standing. She did not look at Nancy. She didn't have to. Her stare, hard and unflinching, carved across the room. Over the flags, over the blinking cameras, over the rows of polished faces, challenging everyone to hear what they had spent too long ignoring. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but carved from iron, every word anchoring itself into the floorboards and refusing to be moved. 70% of recipients are children, the elderly, and the disabled. Each category landed like a stone dropped into the hollow chest of the room. She didn't need notes. She didn't need graphs. These numbers weren't abstract to her. They were faces, hands, lives she knew too well to forget. The energy around her shifted subtly, the Democrats straightening, the Republicans stiffening, as if the truth itself had grown too heavy to pretend away. Jasmine's voice did not rise. She did not slam the table. She did not gesture wildly. Instead, she let the truth drip steadily, like water eroding stone. Pulling facts from the CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services, with the same certainty as sunrise. These are not opinions. These are not partisan games. Each syllable sharpening the blade. Facts, not myths, should guide us. Her words were not a plea. They were not a request. They were an indictment. An indictment of every lie, every convenient myth, every excuse used to justify cruelty, wrapped in the language of responsibility. And as she stood there, solid as bedrock, the mask of respectable debate that had cloaked the hearing began to fracture. Jasmine let the silence stretch again, but this time it belonged to her. When she spoke next, it was a scalpel to the heart of the issue. Or is it easier to blame the poor than to fix a broken system? The question didn't seek an answer. It didn't need one. It hovered there, heavy and merciless, demanding that every soul in the room feel the full shame of what had just been exposed. In the seconds that followed, no one moved. No one breathed too loudly. It wasn't because they were stunned by the numbers. It was because they knew, deep down, that everything she said was true, and none of them could look her in the eye and deny it, without lying to themselves first. The silence after Jasmine's words had sharpened the air to the point of pain. Every breath felt measured, every movement deliberate, as if the wrong twitch might cause the entire room to implode. Nancy Mace sat rigidly, her hands flat on the folder in front of her, the tips of her fingers pressing so hard against the leather that her knuckles turned white. For a few seconds, she managed to hold still, to keep the brittle facade of control intact. But it wasn't built to last. The precision of Jasmine's attack, rooted not in rage but in cold, unassailable fact, had cracked something deep inside her, something she couldn't patch over with bravado. A tremor flickered at the corner of her mouth. Her foot tapped once, sharply against the polished floor, a restless betrayal of the pressure mounting inside her chest. Then she stood up too quickly, her chair scraping backward with an ugly screech that made heads turn. She didn't wait for a signal. She didn't mask the anger curling inside her voice. It came out raw, harsh, the words propelled by pure, reckless frustration. We can't keep funding welfare queens and expect our economy to survive. No one moved, no one breathed. It was as if the room itself had recoiled, stunned into a terrible, ringing stillness. For one long, bottomless second, the room stopped breathing. The words echoed off the high marble walls, hitting harder because they had not been calculated. They had erupted, ugly and naked, from somewhere deeper than strategy. Every face in the room shifted, some in shock, some in instant shame, some in something closer to fear. The noise of pens tapping, paper shuffling, low murmurs. Everything died in an instant, leaving only the mechanical whir of the cameras capturing every devastating frame. On the Republican side, several lawmakers instinctively dropped their gazes, as if by looking busy, they could erase the fact that they had heard it too clearly. Some flipped pages of their documents with trembling fingers. Others reached for pens that had no ink, scribbling nonsense to create the illusion of being occupied. None dared look across the aisle. None dared meet the cold, piercing stare rising steadily from Jasmine Crockett's side of the room. Nancy stood there, chest heaving slightly, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides, realizing too late the depth of the wound she had just torn open. It wasn't just a political gaffe. It wasn't just a bad choice of words. It was an old, festering truth, dragged screaming back into the light. And there was no taking it back. The weight of Nancy's words still hung in the air, raw and poisonous. The room itself seemed to seize, caught between the instinct to intervene and the fear of witnessing something too true to interrupt. The chairman of the committee, an older man whose face had weathered decades of political storms, instinctively lifted his hand as if to call for order. His fingers hovered mid-air, trembling slightly, caught between duty and dread. His eyes darted between Nancy's rigid stance and the molten silence swelling across the room. For a moment, he seemed ready to speak, to scold, to patch the tear in decorum with the authority of his gavel. But he didn't. Some primal sense told him this was not a moment to suppress. It was a fault line opening in real time, and no procedural hammer could stop what was about to break loose. Across the room, the camera crews, sensing blood in the water, swung their lenses in unison toward the woman who had not yet spoken. Jasmine Crockett sat frozen, not with fear, but with a terrifying stillness that commanded every eye. The cameras zoomed tighter on her face, catching the way her jaw set like granite, the way her eyes locked forward without so much as a blink. Her expression was not anger, not even contempt. It was the cold, unblinking judgment of someone who had heard it all before and was no longer surprised. Around her, the air itself seemed to constrict, as if even breathing too loudly might shatter the fragile moment teetering on the edge of history. The silence was a living thing now, coiled and waiting. And into that brutal stillness, Jasmine Crockett rose, not to match fury with fury, but to bring the blade of truth down, cleanly. Jasmine pushed her chair back, with the barest whisper of sound, standing slowly, her movements as measured and inevitable as a rising tide. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Every eye in the room snapped to her, as if pulled by a magnetic force, as if, somewhere deep inside, they all understood that what was about to happen could not be undone. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, open, empty, yet somehow more dangerous than any weapon. Her gaze swept the room, not stopping on Nancy Mace, not even needing to. Jasmine addressed something bigger, something woven into the bones of the place itself. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost too calm, like a scalpel drawn carefully across already bruised flesh. You just dragged a racist relic from the past into this room. Each word pronounced with a clarity so sharp it seemed to cut the stale air. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't flinch. She let the words land, with their full, devastating weight, and she waited, daring the room to pretend it hadn't heard. Her eyes were twin points of stillness in the chaos, reflecting back not anger, but the merciless certainty of someone who had carried the cost of those words all her life. She held the silence hostage for one beat longer, and then, with a slight tilt of her head that carried the final slice, finished. Own it. Jasmine didn't rush. She let the silence stretch another second longer, a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the skin. Then, she took one slow step forward, a deliberate movement that sent a ripple through the ranks of men and women frozen at their seats. She didn't shout. She didn't gesticulate. She spoke the way a scalpel cuts, not with force, but with lethal precision. The phrase welfare queen wasn't born from facts, she said, her voice level, her tone surgical, slicing through the stale air. It was born from politics, from fear, from a deliberate choice to turn struggling Black mothers into symbols of greed and fraud. She paused, letting the accusations sink into the floor, into the bones of the committee, into the pitiless lenses of the cameras rolling. Her gaze swept the room, not searching for sympathy, but stripping away any pretense of ignorance. In the 1980s, she continued, her voice a few degrees colder now, Ronald Reagan needed a villain. He needed a face to attach to the narrative that America's problems weren't caused by greed at the top, but by the poor taking too much from the bottom. She spoke of Linda Taylor, the woman Reagan had pointed to, a woman whose complex, tragic life had been flattened into a racial caricature. Jasmine's voice didn't rise. If anything, it dropped, growing quieter but sharper, forcing the room to lean in to hear. The media took the bait, the country took the bait, and overnight, the term welfare queen wasn't just a slur, it was policy. It was a justification for slashing support, for letting children go hungry, for telling single mothers that their lives were their own fault. She paused again, her stillness more deafening than any shout could have been. The Republicans avoided her eyes. Some Democrats stared at their hands. The cameras caught it all, the shame, the discomfort, the heavy recognition that this wasn't ancient history at all, but a wound still wide open, still bleeding. Jasmine stood alone in that silence, carrying the invisible weight of every woman who had been labeled, blamed, erased. Her voice, when it returned, was quieter still, but it hit with the force of a hammer striking glass. When you choose your words, you choose your side in history. And there was no mistaking which side had just been chosen. The weight of Jasmine's words hadn't yet fully settled. When Nancy Mace lurched forward, a desperate motion, born not of strategy, but of pure, raw panic. Her face, already flushed from the heat of the exchange, deepened into an alarming shade of red, the kind that no amount of political polish could conceal. She straightened sharply, her chair scraping back an inch, with a sharp, ugly sound, trying to seize the room again before it slipped entirely from her grasp. The tremor in her fingers betrayed her, a small but unmistakable sign that she was no longer speaking from prepared lines or confidence. This was survival mode. I meant the people who commit welfare fraud, she barked out, her voice too loud, brittle at the edges, cracking in a way that echoed unnaturally against the stone walls. Not about race, she snapped, the words tumbling out in a rush, like she could outrun the accusation if only she spoke fast enough. But no amount of speed could bury the truth now. Her outburst didn't reset the room. It didn't reclaim the high ground. It only magnified the very guilt she was trying to deny. Across the vast oak table, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't lean back. She didn't fold her arms. She didn't even break eye contact. Instead, she stepped forward, not physically, but with the sheer force of her presence, crashing into Nancy's flimsy defense with the precision of a scalpel. Her voice remained cool, steady, each syllable laced with a quiet violence, far more devastating than any shouted rebuttal. Why then? Jasmine asked, her words slow, deliberate, each one a nail hammered deep. Did you choose that phrase, one soaked in blood and prejudice? The question hung there, heavier than the marble columns surrounding them, denser than the thick air no one seemed able to breathe. It wasn't just a rhetorical blow. It was an indictment, delivered with surgical precision, before an entire nation watching live. Jasmine's tone didn't waver, didn't soften. It remained cold and exact, as a courtroom verdict, allowing no space for escape, no comfort in ambiguity. Nancy's mouth opened slightly, as if the beginnings of another protest were forming on her tongue. But no words came. Her chest rose and fell, in uneven, shallow breaths. Her eyes darted reflexively, to the chairman, to her aides seated along the wall, to the cameras stationed like merciless sentries at every angle. There was no help to be found, no friendly interruption, no procedural objection, no shield from the trap she had walked into, willingly. Every second that passed in silence was another blow, another second that the world could see her unraveling. The polished floor beneath her sensible heels might as well have turned to quicksand. The Republican side of the table, once filled with quiet nods and stiff approval, had gone deathly still. Some senators busied themselves with shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. Others stared down at their notes with a furious intensity, as if sheer concentration could make them invisible. No one stepped forward. No one backed her up. Even those who privately agreed with her dared not align themselves with the mess she had created. The cameras caught everything. The sidelong glances, the tightening of jaws, the tiny shifts of weight, as grown men and women shrank back into their chairs. Nancy cleared her throat once, sharply, a sound that cracked across the microphone in front of her and seemed to make the tension worse, not better. Her hands, which had once commanded the room with brisk gestures and pointed arguments, now trembled slightly as she fumbled with the folder of notes she no longer dared look at. Somewhere deep inside, she must have known there was no salvaging the moment. Not with clarifications, not with apologies, not when the phrase had already been uttered, not when it had already bared everything she had tried so carefully to keep hidden. Jasmine didn't speak again. She didn't need to. She let the silence grind Nancy down. Let the weight of history, the real, brutal history, fill the chamber, until even the chandeliers overhead seemed to bow under it. Jasmine's eyes never left Nancy's. She didn't glare. She didn't smirk. She simply stared, steady and pitiless, like the living embodiment of every voice that had been silenced. Every life caricatured and dismissed by the very narrative Nancy had tried to resurrect. It wasn't personal vengeance. It was something colder, deeper, more righteous, the relentless machinery of truth, bearing down on a lie that could not stand. Nancy shifted her weight again, the motion awkward and jerky, as if she could physically escape the question still burning between them. I just meant, she started, voice faltering halfway through the sentence, the words dissolving into nothing. She stopped, realizing too late that every incomplete, broken phrase only made it worse. Her eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the panic of a politician trapped under the full weight of her own choices. Broadcast live to millions. No one moved to help her. No one reached out a hand. She stood utterly alone, naked beneath the unblinking lights, drowning in a silence far louder than any accusation. The chairman fidgeted in his seat, his hand hovering near the gavel. But he knew, as everyone did, it was too late for order. You cannot hammer truth back into silence. Once it has broken free. Around the room, staffers shifted nervously. Reporters leaned forward, pens frozen midair, their faces illuminated by the sickly glow of their tablets, as they documented the moment America would replay in endless, brutal loops. The cameras zoomed in tighter on Nancy's face, on the slight quiver of her lower lip, on the tightness around her eyes, on the raw, human crack in the mask she had worn into the room that morning. Jasmine Crockett didn't smirk. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The truth was not a weapon she had wielded. It was the AIR she had simply allowed to exist again. Nancy Mace was left gasping in it, drowning, not because someone had attacked her, but because she could no longer hide from herself. And still, Jasmine said nothing, because sometimes the most devastating thing you can say is nothing at all. The room's silence shattered, not with words, but with the quiet, relentless clicking of cameras, the invisible buzz of data packets flying out into the world, where the real war was just beginning. It didn't take minutes. It didn't even take seconds. As soon as Nancy Mace's voice cracked and faltered under Jasmine Crockett's unflinching gaze, the first clip was already racing across cyberspace. Somewhere in the press pit, a reporter's thumb jabbed the upload button with the urgency of a detonator. A few beats later, the raw footage hit Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, spreading like wildfire, fueled by decades of buried anger and fresh betrayal. The moment Nancy's mouth twisted around the words, "welfare queens," followed by Jasmine's lethal, poised dissection, became instant digital ammunition. Within minutes, the hashtag #SheWelfareQuengate exploded onto the trending charts, burning its way into millions of timelines. Clips looped endlessly, some slowed to catch every flicker of panic in Nancy's face. Others zoomed in on Jasmine's ice-cold stare, framing her like a general surveying a fallen enemy. The comments flooded in faster than anyone could count, a furious river of outrage, vindication, and old, festering wounds, torn wide open again for the world to see. Finally, someone says it. They've been hiding behind that language for decades. Jasmine Crockett just burned the house down, and all she used was the truth. Cable news was slower, but only barely. Within the hour, CNN interrupted its scheduled programming to break down the clip frame by frame, their anchors' faces a careful blend of shock and solemnity. MSNBC followed minutes later, their legal analysts already dissecting Jasmine's choice of words with the reverence usually reserved for historic court rulings. Fox News, never one to back down from a fight, immediately pivoted into defense mode, painting Nancy Mace as a victim of cancel culture run amok, their lower thirds blazing with headlines like GOPREPUNDERFIREFORSPEAKINGTHETRUTH. Across the ideological spectrum, battle lines were drawn, not with bullets or bayonets, but with sound bites and captions, with viral videos and fiery opinion columns. Every show, every host, every guest scrambled to stake their claim on the narrative, twisting, framing, shouting over each other, until the truth became less a point of agreement and more a weapon in a sprawling cultural war. In brightly lit studios across the country, political commentators leaned in over their glossy desks, their voices rising in fervor, as they fought to define what had just happened. On one side, they spoke of Jasmine Crockett with almost religious awe, the conscience America forgot it needed, a scalpel against systemic rot, the voice of a history too long denied. Pundits praised not just her facts, but her composure, her refusal to meet cruelty with spectacle, her ability to make the weight of history feel like a living, breathing force in that sterile government room. She didn't yell, one commentator said, shaking his head in disbelief. She didn't grandstand. She wielded silence like a blade, and it cut deeper than any outrage ever could. Mitumatum. In glowing think pieces rushed out before midnight, writers compared Jasmine to figures like Rosa Parks, like Angela Davis, like Shirley Chisholm. Women who had, with small, deliberate acts, forced America to confront the ugliness it preferred to ignore. Her calm, steady voice had landed like a hammer, and now the cracks were spreading. But on the other side, a different storm was brewing. Nancy's defenders scrambled to frame her stumble as a misunderstanding, a clumsy misstep, weaponized by a media mob hungry for blood. Conservative talk shows played and replayed the clip, layering heavy commentary over it, slowing Jasmine's words to make her seem condescending, speeding up Nancy's defense to make her sound frantic but sincere. Some hosts argued that welfare queen had become a neutral term over time, an absurdity that only served to inflame the backlash further. Others dug in harder, leaning into the racial dog whistles with open glee, accusing Jasmine of race baiting, of playing the victim card, of attacking hardworking Americans who pay taxes. Their audiences ate it up, reposting, retweeting, refueling the flames. Death threats began trickling into Jasmine's office. Before the sun set that night, her staff turned off the public comment lines within hours, overwhelmed by the volume and venom. But inside Jasmine's camp, no one was surprised. They knew the cost of speaking clearly in a country still warring with its own memory. Meanwhile, memes exploded across every platform, some triumphant, others vicious. One image showed Jasmine standing like a general on a battlefield, littered with broken microphones and splintered talking points, her expression unbothered, unbroken. Another, more insidious, depicted her with exaggerated features, under bold text accusing her of hating America, a tired smear tactic, as old as Reconstruction, dressed up now for the internet age. But no matter how the footage was spun, no matter how furiously the counterattacks raged, the undeniable truth was already out there. Flashing across 100 million screens, a black woman had faced down centuries of coded cruelty, and she hadn't blinked. In editorial rooms, nervous producers debated whether to air longer cuts of the exchange, whether giving Jasmine's full speech oxygen would tip the balance too far. On Twitter Spaces and TikTok Lives, activists organized rapid response teams, ready to drown out misinformation with the full force of grassroots fury. Fundraising emails flew out from progressive organizations before midnight, praising Jasmine's courage, promising to build on this moment. Even seasoned politicians, some of whom had privately grumbled about Jasmine's unapologetic style, rushed to issue public statements of support once they saw where public sentiment was surging. In the span of hours, the hearing room at the Capitol, a room that had, for decades, been a graveyard of polite evasions and buried truths, became the epicenter of a national reckoning. And at the heart of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, steady, unyielding, refusing to let history be rewritten again in real time. Across the screens, across the headlines, one message became clear. In a single afternoon, the balance of who got to define America's story had shifted. And Jasmine Crockett was no longer waiting for permission to tell it. The internet could twist, spin, and distort, but in the streets, in the churches, in the union halls and neighborhood centers, the truth roared back with a fury no talking head could contain. It started small, one or two local activists posting videos from their community centers, their voices tight with anger but sharpened with purpose. Then came the pastors, standing behind wooden pulpits scarred from decades of struggle. their sermons catching fire not with rhetoric, but with righteous fury. They didn't need to exaggerate Nancy's words. They only needed to play them aloud. And when they did, the reaction was immediate, electric, as if an old wound had been ripped open and salted in front of a nation that had promised it was healing. Black voters, from Atlanta to Detroit to Baltimore, flooded the streets, not with violent protest, but with the kind of organized, unyielding resistance that had built the very foundation of American democracy. Handmade signs appeared overnight, blunt and brutal. "We are not your caricatures. Our children are not your punchlines." History watches. Each rally, each press conference, each prayer meeting stitched together a living indictment, one that no apology from Nancy, no carefully worded statement from her office could erase. Within 24 hours, civil rights organizations roared to life, releasing statements so fast they practically bled onto the page. The NAACP called for a formal censure. Black Lives Matter organized a day of silence, where thousands blacked out their social media, posting nothing but Jasmine Crockett's face under the words, "We hear you." The Urban League demanded not just an apology, but a systemic review of congressional language policies, calling Nancy's words not a slip, but a symptom. Even older, more cautious groups, ones normally careful not to alienate political allies, found themselves pushed by their members to speak out, louder, clearer, sharper. It wasn't just about one phrase. It wasn't just about Nancy. It was about the deep, gnawing feeling that no matter how many elections were won, no matter how many marches were walked, America's halls of power still echoed with the same old slurs, just better dressed. Nancy's office became a fortress overnight. The phones rang until they were ripped from the walls. Staffers, some loyal, some terrified, worked in rotating shifts, scanning emails that poured in by the tens of thousands. Threats, demands, heartbreak, rage. It all blurred into a relentless flood of fury they couldn't hope to manage. No press conference Nancy scheduled could stem it. No carefully chosen words could clean the stain. Even when she tried to apologize, standing stiffly behind a podium, reading haltingly from a prepared statement about poor word choice and deep respect for all communities, the damage was already done. The cameras caught the way she wouldn't meet the lens directly, the way her voice cracked not from emotion, but from fear. The public heard what she didn't say, that she was sorry not for the wound, but for the cost of being caught bleeding. Inside Capitol Hill, the chill spread even faster. Moderate colleagues, those who had once nodded and smiled at her jokes in private, who had shared fundraising dinners and photo ops, now avoided her in the marble corridors. Meetings were rescheduled. Invitations were withdrawn. Eyes once quick to meet hers now slid away, pretending deep absorption in non-existent texts or invisible notes. Even allies on her own side of the aisle shifted uneasily when cameras were near, unwilling to be caught in the same frame, unwilling to risk their own careers for a woman now radioactive. At one point, walking through the Rayburn office building, Nancy passed a group of fellow Republicans huddled in whispered conversation. As she approached, they grew silent, not awkwardly, not apologetically, but with an almost mechanical precision, as if a trap had just snapped shut behind her. She didn't look at them. She didn't have to. The cold weight in her gut told her everything. She was alone now. The worst of it, though, wasn't the public shaming. It wasn't even the professional isolation. It was the way her name started to change. In private emails leaked to the press, some party operatives referred to her not as representative, Nancy Mace, but simply as the problem. In think tanks and lobbying groups, conversations about 2026 re-election maps began quietly erasing her district, redrawing lines without her name attached. On late-night TV, comedians who had once treated her as a minor footnote now carved her into punchlines sharp enough to draw blood. Even among her own staff, a quiet panic began to spread. One by one, resumes were updated. Discreet meetings were taken. People began planning for life after Nancy Mace, before her fall could drag them under too. And yet, for all the political damage, for all the media spectacle, the most devastating blows came not from pundits or politicians, but from ordinary people. Handwritten letters began arriving by the hundreds, some furious, some heartbreaking, some simply exhausted. A woman from Birmingham wrote, "My mother cleaned houses so I could have a future. You called her a thief." A retired veteran from Houston wrote, "I fought for this country. You fought to shame me on national TV." A young college student from Chicago wrote, "You told me, without saying it, that I don't belong here. I heard you loud and clear." These weren't tweets. These weren't anonymous trolls. They were the voices of a country that had spent too long biting its tongue and was now finally speaking without fear. Nancy tried to ignore them. She tried to work. She tried to talk about inflation, taxes, foreign policy, anything but what she had said. But it was no use. Every question at every press conference circled back like a vulture. Every headline stapled her name to that moment like a scarlet letter. Welfare Queen scandal. Nancy Mace and the ghosts of Reagan's America. Words matter. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. No victory lap, no gloating. She simply kept working, kept showing up, kept standing taller every time Nancy shrank a little more. Because Jasmine knew something Nancy was only now learning the hard way. When you unleash a truth too big to deny, you don't have to keep shouting it. You only have to survive long enough for the world to see it too. And now the whole world was watching. As Nancy's fall became inevitable, Jasmine's rise began. Not by her own hand, but by the thousands who saw in her a voice they had waited too long to hear. Jasmine Crockett didn't plan to become a symbol. She hadn't stood in that hearing room thinking about headlines or hashtags or movements. But sometimes history chooses its champions, not with ceremony, but with fire. Within days, her face became a rallying cry across campuses, community centers, and social media feeds. Her calm defiance, her steady voice, her refusal to bend under the oldest weight in America's political playbook. Young progressives, many of them too young to remember the earliest battles for civil rights, found in her a new kind of hero. Fierce without theatrics, unapologetic without cruelty, factual but never mechanical. Memes blossomed with her quotes superimposed over storm clouds, rising suns, shattered chains. "Facts, not myths, should guide us," became a mantra whispered in classrooms, shouted in protest chants, printed onto banners flapping above crowds gathering across Washington, D.C. and beyond. Overnight, Jasmine became something larger than herself, a vessel for anger, hope, vindication, and the stubborn, unkillable dream that the truth could still shake the foundations of power. But symbols, she would soon learn, are easy targets. And the machine that had built its fortunes on distortion and fear was already turning its sights on her. The attacks started almost before the applause faded. First came the whisper campaigns, anonymous blogs dredging up old lawsuits she had won, twisting legal victories into fabricated scandals. Then came the doctored videos, clips where her speeches were spliced to make her seem angry, irrational, unstable. Far-right talk shows filled their screens with grainy images of Jasmine mid-sentence, frozen at awkward angles, their captions shrieking about radicals taking over Congress. They accused her of hating America. They accused her of wanting to dismantle capitalism, the Constitution, the very fabric of the country. Some pundits went further, resurrecting tired racist tropes dressed up in the language of concern, questioning whether someone so emotional could be trusted with real leadership. The smear machine churned on, tireless and ravenous, vomiting out misinformation faster than her team could refute it. Jasmine didn't flinch publicly, but inside her office, the exhaustion began to spread like smoke under a door you couldn't close. Meanwhile, the streets outside the Capitol changed. What had started as scattered, angry tweets became bodies. Bodies moving, gathering, chanting. Small protests flared outside government buildings in the days after the hearing, like sparks on dry grass, stubborn and hard to contain. Students from Howard University marched shoulder to shoulder with nurses from DC General and retirees from Anacostia, chanting for dignity, for truth, for protection of the social safety nets that had always been under attack, whether by slander or by scalpel. Their signs were brutally clear: protect our communities. Welfare is not a crime. Words have consequences. The smell of Sharpies and cardboard mixed with the cold spring air and songs from older battles, the anthems of the 60s, rose up again, not as nostalgia, but as a reminder. This fight had never really ended. The protests grew louder with every news segment that tried to bury them. By the end of the week, the barricades around the Capitol were up again, not to protect lawmakers from foreign threats, but from the judgment of their own people. Police presence thickened. Helicopters circled overhead like vultures. Reporters jostled to capture the best footage of signs waving in the air, of chants echoing through the marble corridors like angry ghosts. Jasmine's name was everywhere, on the lips of teenagers holding homemade signs, on the buttons pinned to denim jackets, on the hashtags painted across walls in bright, defiant colors. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't orchestrated it, but it was hers now, whether she wanted it or not. Inside her office, Jasmine watched the surge from behind heavy glass windows, feeling the weight of every cheer, every slur, every hope and hatred hurled toward her. She met with her exhausted staff late into the night, drafting statements that tried to walk the impossible line between seizing momentum and staying grounded in the brutal reality of politics. She listened to the voicemails, the ones thanking her for standing tall, the ones promising vengeance for daring to speak. Every choice felt razor thin, too bold, and she risked being painted as an extremist, too cautious, and she risked betraying the very people who had lifted her up. And underneath it all, humming in her chest like a second heartbeat, was the simple, aching truth. She was no longer just herself. She was now an idea, and ideas could not bleed. But the people who carried them could. The attacks escalated. Fake dossiers circulated online, claiming she had ties to extremist groups she had never met. Pundits speculated wildly about her personal life, questioning her faith, her family, her right to even be in the room where she had stood so unflinchingly days before. One morning, Jasmine's staff found that her official congressional website had been hacked, plastered with racial slurs before they managed to pull it offline. The message was clear. She had been marked, not just as an opponent, not just as a voice, as a threat, but still the crowds kept growing. Still the chants got louder. Still the signs multiplied, slick with rain and smudged with sweat, demanding not just apologies, not just hearings, but structural change. People remembered. They always had. They just needed someone brave enough to say it out loud. And now they had her. Walking out of her office late one evening, Jasmine paused at the top of the Capitol steps. Below her in the pooling darkness, a small knot of protesters still gathered, huddled against the chill, holding signs aloft like battered shields. They didn't know she was there. They weren't performing. They were simply existing, simply refusing to be silent. And as she watched them, her breath fogging in the cold, Jasmine Crockett understood something deeper than slogans and speeches. The fight wasn't about a viral moment. It wasn't even about her. It was about survival, about dignity, about standing up again and again and again, no matter how many times they tried to beat you back down. And that, she thought, would always be bigger than any smear. They had thrown every weapon at her, mockery, distortion, silence. And yet as the final hearing drew to a close, it was Jasmine Crockett who still stood, unbroken, carrying not just her own voice, but the weight of a generation demanding to be seen. The committee room, once roaring with the clatter of debate and the steady hum of whispered side conversations, had fallen into a strange, brittle kind of stillness. Papers lay forgotten. Pens rested, idle and abandoned. Even the relentless shuffle of staffers' footsteps beyond the chamber walls seemed to have paused, as if the entire building was holding its breath for what it sensed was coming. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly from her seat, the legs of her chair scraping lightly against the polished floor, a whisper of movement that sounded louder than a shout in the cavernous room. She didn't glance at the notes laid neatly before her. She didn't reach for the printed remarks her aides had carefully prepared the night before. Instead, she lifted her chin, squaring her shoulders not against her enemies, but against the long shadow of history itself. Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces now stiff with expectation, discomfort, guilt, before she shifted her weight forward and turned directly toward the cameras. toward the millions beyond the marble walls who could no longer claim ignorance. The silence stretched, taut and trembling, and then she spoke. Not loudly, not urgently, but with the kind of quiet that made every word crash like thunder. "When you see someone struggling," Jasmine said, her voice slicing through the thick air like a blade honed from fire and sorrow, "do you see a burden, or do you see a brother?" The words did not need embellishment. They did not need volume or theatrics. They stood on their own, raw and blistering, searing themselves into the flesh of everyone who heard them. Across the room, no one moved. No one dared shift in their seat or murmur a polite acknowledgement. It was as if the gravity of the question pinned them to their chairs, nailed their hearts to the floor. The question was not rhetorical. It was a mirror, sudden and merciless, reflecting back a truth many had spent their lives desperately trying not to see. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't look away. She held the line with her body, with her breath, demanding, without shouting, without pleading, that every person in that room and every person watching from their living room couches or their subway seats or their break room corners reckon with themselves. And the reckoning was brutal. It moved like an invisible shockwave through the chamber, rippling across the marble columns and the velvet drapes, across the worn faces of career politicians and the fresh, hopeful ones of new staffers. It froze every instinct to clap, every conditioned reflex to smile, to perform. Even the chairman, who had survived decades of political knife fights, sat rigid and silent, his gavel forgotten at his side. The members of Congress, Democrats, Republicans, independents alike, became for a fleeting moment nothing more than an audience to their own complicity. Some dropped their eyes, unable to meet the relentless, unwavering gaze of a woman who had dragged the truth from history's grave and laid it bare on the polished wood before them. Outside, the world kept turning. Cars rushed down Constitution Avenue. News anchors scrambled to rewrite their scripts. Social media feeds updated faster than any human hand could scroll. But inside that room, time ground down to something heavier, thicker, more real. Jasmine's words hung suspended in the charged air, untouched by spin, unshielded by talking points. They didn't need interpretation. They didn't need a political lens to matter. They were not a speech. They were not a soundbite. They were a test. And every man and woman who heard them, truly heard them, knew instinctively whether they had passed or failed. Jasmine didn't linger. She didn't drag the moment out. She didn't savor the discomfort. She simply stood there, the ghost of a breath still visible in the cold air, before offering the briefest, smallest nod, half acknowledgement, half benediction, and stepping back from the microphone. The movement broke the spell slightly, a ripple of almost motion passing through the stunned bodies around her, but still no one clapped. No one dared. To clap would have cheapened it. To clap would have implied that this was a performance. And it wasn't. It was an indictment. It was a funeral bell for the easy lies they had all told themselves about who struggled and why. The cameras didn't blink either. They stayed locked on Jasmine's face, drinking in the steel of her eyes, the steadiness of her breath, the living proof that not every battle leaves its soldiers broken. Somewhere deep in the control rooms of CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, producers shouted for their teams to stay live, stay rolling, capture it all. Somewhere in the dark basements and glowing living rooms across the country, watchers leaned closer to their screens, feeling something shift in their bones even if they didn't yet have the words for it. Somewhere inside thousands of chests, hearts cracked open, not from tragedy, but from recognition. Recognition that this wasn't about political parties or budget line items or talking heads barking at each other in endless loops. It was about seeing, about refusing at last to look away. And still no applause came. Just that heavy, beautiful, terrible silence, thick as blood, heavy as debt, undeniable as breath. Jasmine stood for one more heartbeat longer, then gathered her papers, papers she had never even glanced at, and walked quietly back to her seat. Her steps were sure. Her head stayed high. Behind her, the stunned members of the committee sat like statues carved from guilt and fear, knowing instinctively that no procedural vote, no amendment, No clever speech could wipe away what had just happened. They had been seen, and there was no going back. Outside the Capitol, the early evening had deepened into a strange, bracing chill. Small knots of protesters still lingered, bundled against the cold, their signs wilting but their voices stronger than ever. Reporters jostled to file their updates. Buses rumbled by, unaware that the conversation inside the nation's bloodstream had already shifted irrevocably. When you see someone struggling, Jasmine had asked, and millions for the first time in a very long time were asking themselves, quietly, painfully, honestly, what do I see? Long after the protests faded and the news cycles moved on, the real aftermath of Jasmine's stand began to settle. In hearts, in conversations, in the quiet reckoning of a country forced to look itself in the mirror. The truest legacy of that moment wasn't written in laws or headlines. It unfolded instead in 1,000 unseen places, in kitchens where mothers explained dignity to their children, in union halls where workers whispered about justice, in voices newly sharpened by truth, in quiet prayers muttered by men and women who had spent a lifetime carrying burdens no one had seen. The question Jasmine Crockett had planted refused to wither. It burrowed deep into the cracked foundation of a nation that had long preferred simple villains and simpler answers. When you see someone struggling, do you see a burden or a brother? It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't a campaign line. It was a reckoning wrapped in 12 words, a call to shatter the easy stories that had justified indifference for generations. Across kitchen tables and church pews, across college campuses and boardrooms, the same unease stirred, not guilt for being privileged, but shame for ever having seen dignity as something that needed to be earned. Jasmine had thrown a match into dry timber, and America was burning, not with destruction, but with the painful, necessary fire of recognition. The message was painfully simple, and that was what made it so dangerous to the old systems. It asked people to stop hiding behind statistics, to stop pretending that poverty, struggle, and suffering were signs of failure instead of the scars of systems built to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Jasmine's confrontation exposed a truth many knew, but few dared say, that indifference was never neutral, that every shrugged shoulder, every averted gaze, every whispered joke about the poor or the desperate was a choice to dehumanize, to erase, to push suffering out of sight rather than confront it. She didn't just indict a single politician. She didn't just dismantle a decades-old lie. She redefined what it meant to see, to bear witness, to be responsible. And in doing so, she forced a country built on myths of meritocracy to face a truth older than any flag. We are all responsible for each other, or we are nothing at all. But the deeper lesson wasn't just about the oppressed, it was about the oppressors too. Because in that hearing room, Jasmine hadn't screamed. She hadn't demeaned. She hadn't met cruelty with cruelty. She had stared down centuries of slander and smiled, not with mockery, but with unshakable knowledge. Knowledge that those who weaponize language against the vulnerable aren't powerful. They're afraid that if they must meet every man, every woman, every child as an equal, their own measure might be found wanting. Afraid that if they are forced to see the humanity of those they diminish, they will have to answer for what they have allowed. Jasmine's strength was not in crushing her opponents. It was in standing so calmly in the truth that their weapons fell harmlessly at her feet, exposed as nothing more than old lies dressed in new suits. And yet her victory was not without a cost. To stand alone against an entire system built on convenience and cruelty is to walk into a storm without armor. It means carrying not just your own dignity, but the unbearable weight of every story erased before yours. It means being reduced to a symbol when you long simply to be a person. It means waking every morning to praise you did not seek and hate you did not deserve. But it also means, in rare searing moments, sparking something that no army, no government, no smear campaign can extinguish. Hope. Hope that seeing the truth, really seeing it, is not the end of comfort, but the beginning of conscience. Hope that the next time someone stands on the edge of despair, they will not be seen as a burden to be pitied or discarded, but as a brother to be lifted. The deepest truth of Jasmine's story wasn't about politics at all. It was about the choices we make when no one is watching. It was about whether we allow ourselves to be complicit through silence. It was about whether we meet vulnerability with disdain or with grace. It was about how easy it is to look away and how dangerous it is to pretend that looking away absolves us of responsibility. Because poverty is not a flaw, struggle is not a crime, and needing help does not strip a person of their dignity. The systems that create inequality are vast and complex, but the choice to see each other fully, to meet need with solidarity instead of scorn, remains achingly simple. Jasmine didn't demand guilt. She demanded recognition. She didn't call for shame. She called for courage. And perhaps if America heard her, not just with their ears, but with their hearts, her stand could be more than a viral moment. It could be a beginning, the beginning of a different kind of seeing. One where compassion is not weakness, but strength. One where dignity is not something earned, but something recognized as inherent. One where the measure of a nation's greatness is not how it treats its most powerful, but how it lifts its most vulnerable. When you see someone struggling, do you see a burden or a brother? In the end, that question was not Jasmine Crockett's burden to answer. It was ours. But if seeing the truth was the first step, then standing for it, fighting for it, was the step that mattered most. The story didn't end with a courtroom silence or a viral quote. Stories like Jasmine's never do. They either ignite movements or they are buried by apathy. And now it was no longer her fight alone. It belonged to everyone who had heard the question and felt it lodge inside their ribs like a burning brand. This wasn't the time for applause from a distance. It wasn't enough to admire courage while leaving the weight of the world on the shoulders of the few willing to carry it. Real change demanded more. More voices, more hands, more relentless, stubborn action. It demanded that we show up, not when it was convenient, not when it was easy, but when it mattered most. Because injustice doesn't wait for perfect timing. It feeds on hesitation, and history doesn't remember the silent. You don't need a podium to fight. You don't need a microphone or a camera crew to stand where you are and refuse to move backward. It starts in the smallest places, in city council meetings, too empty by design, in classrooms where history is twisted until it forgets who built the bones of this nation, in conversations around dinner tables where hard truths have too long been left unsaid. It starts when we refuse to let bigotry slip by in a joke, when we refuse to let cruelty masquerade as common sense, when we refuse to forget who the real burden has always been placed upon. Every petition signed, every rally attended, every vote cast with the full weight of justice behind it. That is action. That is resistance. That is the slow, grinding work of building a future where dignity isn't a privilege, but a given. And it's work too important to leave to someone else. If Jasmine Crockett stood alone once, it was only because we let her. If she stands alone again, it will not be because we didn't know better. The question she left in the air still waits for an answer, but it demands one measured not in words, but in deeds. Support leaders who see humanity before stereotypes. Defend policies that lift rather than crush those who dare to hope. Challenge systems designed to silence the very people they pretend to serve. And most of all, see each other, not through the lenses of fear or resentment, but through the fierce, unyielding belief that every person's worth is non-negotiable. Because the choice was never just between burden and brother. The choice was always between a future chained to the old lies and a future fierce enough to be free. The next chapter is not written. It is waiting, and it is ours to shape. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.